He's Professor Emeritus of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Dr. Donald is a Fellow of the Canadian Psychological Association, the Royal Society of Canada, and the World Academy of Art and Science. He is one of the world's leading experts on the development of the human mind over deep time and is the author of two influential books, Origins of the Modern Mind and A Mind So Rare, as well as numerous published academic and scientific articles. I am genuinely very excited to welcome Dr. Merlin Donald.
Thank you, Josh. All right. As I understand it, this conference is about virtual reality, and I'd just like to point out at the beginning that we have always lived in a virtual reality. The contents of consciousness are really our only reality. We travel through time and space in a bubble called consciousness, and the things that we don't experience are simply not a part of our personal world. And so there's, in a sense, nothing new about virtual reality, except in the way that what we call virtual reality is produced. It's entirely designed, entirely constructed, and to some degree, it controls us rather than the other way around. So I want to talk about my own background, my own theory of how we got to be what we are right now, time travelers in the modern world. We started out, humbly enough, as Miocene apes about 5 million years ago. There's very good evidence for that, especially genetic evidence. And the question is, how did we get here? Well, we went through three transitions that are big enough that we could consider them cognitive steps, more or less plateaus. And the first one was to move from the episodic mindset of an ape. An ape lives in the episode, in the moment, okay, to what I call mimetic culture, a mindset that is expressive, yet not yet linguistic. So that started, I think, way back in my book. First book I proposed about 2 million years ago, but the evidence now goes back to 3.5 million years at least. And that is the time when we had our first stone tools. And now you might question the connection between stone tools and expression. I'll try to clarify that over the next few minutes. Stone tools were used in butchering 3.4 million years ago by a creature called Australopithecus afarensis. That's popularly known as Lucy. They have about 50 individuals that they've studied and recovered DNA from now. Now, the oldest actual discovered tool is 2.6 million years, but they found bones that had, under electron microscope examination, showed evidence of systematic butchering with stone tools that early. So they were already a full step away from the Miocene apes who've never been able to do such things. Those stone tools are a very difficult skill to manufacture. And the very oldest ones are called Oldowan. The more sophisticated ones that are usually identified with Homo, our species, came around 2 million years ago. Now, this is, in the case of the more recent stone tools, the ones from 2 million on, was a master toolkit. It could be used to make other tools, such as spears, tethers, etc. And the skills involved in tool making and tool use enabled us to construct culture. Culture is, in many ways, the joint product of our expressive skills and our ability to transform materials into tools and so on. These refined skills reside in the voluntary control of the embodied self and improved access to what we call procedural memory. I'll explain that in a minute. So what do these old tools show? Well, first of all, that human ancestors were skilled long before they were articulate. There's no reason to postulate language that early, but they were highly skilled. These are very skilled apes who could manufacture tools and by extension do a lot of other things. Those skills are what are called refined procedural memories. And as early as Afarensis, we knew that hominids were doing this. So why was this so difficult? Why don't animals ever practice skills and refine skills? Well, it turns out that there was a very serious cerebral bottleneck blocking them from doing that, and that is that in when you look at the brain, the back side of the brain, the posterior part of the brain, is mostly concerned with perception of the environment, perception of the world. So the various sensory organs lead into that region where you interpret the perceptual world. The frontal regions, including the motor and premotor cortex, are about action. And actions don't look like perceptions. You know, the mapping of the one onto the other is actually a very abstract business. So to learn, let's say, to drive a car, the car and the steering wheel and so don't look anything like the view you get of the road. So it's not a simple mapping problem. To master a skilled performance and do accurate rehearsal, let's say of an athletic performance, you're a dive, you have to plan the dive, you execute, so that's frontal, and you review, but that's posterior. And the whole question is, how do you do that mapping? That's a very difficult thing. You have to rehearse the actions to approach an imagined ideal. So this is not a trivial adaptation. This is a very major change from the Miocene apes. So what I call this adaptation mimesis, because what you're doing is you're imitating a previous action of your own, and you're making it into a procedural memory. It's something that can grow and become different over time. So self-triggered recall is one of the characteristics that this enabled. And what you see here in this diagram is an illustration of just how extraordinary human beings are in this regard. When you dance, let's say you're dancing to a rhythm. The rhythm is the sensory and perceptual experience that you're registering in the back part of the brain. The dance is action that's produced in the front part of the brain. Now, you imagine the rhythm can be any number of different things. I show a time scale there with different rhythms. And on the other side, you can see that you can interpret that. For example, if you were at a rock concert, you could use your eyes for one rhythm, your head, arms, hands. They don't have to be perfectly synchronized. The point is, we can switch back and forth spontaneously and suddenly. And physiologically, this is a very remarkable adaptation. It's not something any other creature does. It requires a very precise kind of self-awareness. So with mimesis, human beings were becoming skilled actors. We're talking about a very long period of time here, over several million years, that we became better and better at this. What we're capable of doing is turning an idealized percept, an imagined kind of action, into a procedural memory. And of course, over time, we became better at this. You can see in the archaeological record. Performance read out the memory in a non-literal manner, adapting to context. So when you do, let's say, a musician playing an instrument, it's always contextual. You have taken into account what else is going on at the same time, who else is performing, and so on. I won't go into the brain thing, but there is plenty of evidence to back this up, and it's getting better and better all the time. So there's an interesting illustration. It's from a museum in Denmark, called the Vosgaard Museum. And they have reconstructions of early humans that were done very scientifically, but with the difference that they look alive. They don't look like, Frankenstein. They look alive. These early hominins were formidable creatures. And as tools became more complex, we know from a number of other studies that pedagogy and extensive socialization were necessary because the skills are getting more complex. And the lesson here is that the actor was born before the speaker, capable of mime, gesture imitation, skill. Basically, nonverbal communication was an inevitable aspect of this. Mimetic culture was built, therefore, on a primate foundation, is highly emotional and competitive, as primates are, but with the additional dimension of mimesis. So, therefore, you can think of a culture of skilled people imitating one another and interacting socially, gesturing, and you can do an awful lot with gesture. You don't need languages in a sense overrated. You could clear a building, you could clear the building you're in if there was a fire, even if everyone in the building spoke a different language from you, you could still get your point across. Um, and the you can regard mimetic culture as the evolved social outcome of our ability to refine procedural memories. The earliest cultural memories were built around school. I have no doubt about that. We were skilled and we plug that into our socialization, our tendency to be very social creatures. So at a hunt, that would lead to cooperation, to ritualized ways of behavior, and so on. So, conclusion here is skill was already a fundamental component of human culture and cognition 3.5 million years ago, but of course became much more advanced after 2 million. And a culture centered around skill, mimetic culture, grew out of this. And gesture, pantomime, nonverbal communication are products of the same ancient neurocognitive change to the human brain that allowed us to make tools and so on. So that carries us through pretty well from the Miocene period to about 1 million years ago, somewhere a million and a half years ago. I think a second stage came in, a second transition, but it was stretched over another million years, and that was the gradual process of symbolic invention in language. See, in my context, language is a cultural invention of human beings. We don't have a language brain. There is no module in the brain that produces language automatically. An isolated human being simply does not produce language, a socially isolated person. Languages are learned from the culture around you. So the question is, well, where did that culture get language in the first place? You could think of culture, of an expressive culture, as a distributed system in computer terms. That is, it involves many brains in interaction. And when I interact with you, or you interact with your child, which of course occurs all the time, you stimulate one another. And if you have an expressive culture, the growth of language of some kind would have been inevitable. But the thing about humans that is so different and so special is our vocal ability. As you probably know, if you've ever watched a video of chimpanzees, their vocalizations are very, very limited. They're sort of a series of squeaks. And so human beings do something that no other primate does, and that just sit here and generate words that have very complicated meanings. So I think language started to evolve, first of all, in a nonverbal way, but when it became oral, the oral channel has the great advantage of working in the dark at a distance, etc. It's a very powerful technique because you can verbalize while you continue to do things with your hands and continue to see things with your eyes. I define language ability, linguistic ability, not in terms of just words, because I think probably we had proto words very early, but rather in the level of narrative. A child really only has language when he or she can tell a story of her own, okay, an original story. And that story reflects the ability to describe complex social events that take place in a longer time zone. Well, that leads to a totally different culture in which you can share observations, experiences, and stories. And languages are really, if you will, just another skill, but an extraordinarily complex skill that takes years and years to acquire, and involves producing sounds according to certain rules. But it's a very complex system, a hierarchical system of procedural memory. That required a massive expansion of the procedural memory capacity and what you call high-speed executive control of attention, because you have to alternate between your linguistic output and someone else's. It's a very complex and a remarkable ability that's unique to human beings. So languages reorganize the brain. Um, they provide you with a much more efficient way of gaining access to your own memories. Other creatures don't do that. You have to, when we talk about conditioning animals, what we're really talking about is getting control over their memory systems. Otherwise, they're at the mercy of the environment. They can't do what we do, simply go inside our heads and recall things from the past. Um, so word systems in the brain are incredibly complex. They involve 4 different aspects: meaning, syntax, morphology, phonology being the actual sounds that you produce and the various networks that produce those sounds. And each neural word system is in a sense a world of its own, and yet you have thousands and thousands of words. And if you're a multilingual speaker, you may have hundreds of thousands and all sorts of different grammars at once. Um, I'm very aware of this because my wife is a translator, professional translator, and has something like 5 languages. Now, the other thing you do that's quite remarkable in language is that you can track a number of different speakers. You can track, um, it's hard to put a limit on it, but at least 6 or 7 speakers in a conversation can track one another. It's very common to have a conversation with 3 or 4 people, which requires multifocal attention. You, in a sense, you open a window for every speaker and you never make a mistake. Isn't it amazing? You remember exactly what everyone said, because if somebody contradicts himself, you can jump on him right away, right? That's what we normally do. We're very good at tracking and isolating streams of conversation that are identified with particular people. And we even remember these things sometimes for years later on. That's a remarkable expansion of what I would call conscious capacity. That is, all of the subsystems that are identified with consciousness are necessary to engage in, let's say, a conversation with another human being. So a third conclusion that we can draw from this is that interactive language networks are demanding in cognitive terms. I've just touched on the surface here, but they're extremely demanding. And the demand goes beyond expanding procedural memory, that is becoming better at skills and acquiring skills, to an exponential growth of semantic memory for meanings. And this is reflected in the disproportionate expansion of certain regions of the brain, which are pretty well documented. The exact timing of those expansions is not fully understood, but if I were a young person going into paleo types of research, I'd go into paleogenetics. There's no question that that's where the future lies. Now, it so happens that when we became speakers, mimesis was retained. And of course, you could say that mimetic culture was greatly developed along with language over the whole time of human evolution, because mimetic imagination is still a human universal. We did a study in Denmark looking at people listening to actually certain detective stories or crime stories and so on, and discovered that the regions, when they listened to these stories and built up the memory of the whole story, they were tested on them later on for recall. The part of the brain that became active was the same one that we identify with mimetic imagination. So there is certainly a case for saying that language is scaffolded on a mimetic platform. Now, the narrative thought is the ability to tell your own story, right? And your autobiographical memory of your own life and your own identity and so on. These are in a culture that is based on storytelling, what I call mythic culture, are allegories, right? If you want to understand something in traditional cultures, you tell a story. That's what the Bible does. That's what Gilgamesh does. All the old stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Myths are essentially normative allegories that shape the cultural factor, and the fabric of an entire culture can be determined by the stories that you share. They're usually imported from social networks, and schools, of course, are part of the social network of the society. So out of this come all kinds of things. You conceive identities, and you differentiate semantic space. You get an incredible number of memories of these kinds in a lifetime. And it also creates large-scale social scenarios of various kinds. Out of this came what I call mythic culture, which is, of course, retains mimesis within it, but it's a culture based on stories, and that includes your own stories, includes your own identity, and your own story is always rehearsed with people you know, people who are very close to you, as well as with yourself. Thinking in this kind of culture is essentially an analogy and allegory. Heroes are archetypes, right? The self becomes identified with other people, so you adopt a tribal identity. We're still vulnerable to the pressures of accepting a tribal identity. And mythic culture has a characteristic, I call it top governance. It's organized enough that there is such a thing as cognitive governance. With, any religious tradition is a good example. There are stories of origin. Nationalism is another way, where there's stories of wars and victories and failures and disasters and so on that are carried on, that become shared to the point where a cognitive community is formed, where people literally distance themselves from other people based on their the overlap in their minds. Basically, I call that a mind sharing culture. So when you share mind with someone, you depending on the degree to which you do this, that person becomes closer to you, and vice versa. So mythic culture is a major step, and you can say that virtually all of the cultures of the world are, to some degree, mythic cultures. So at the same time, we started developing material culture a lot more than we did, let's say, just with stone tools, although stone tools came along with fire and various types of shelter and transportation methods, such as early boats and so on. But as material culture got more complex, human life was largely organized around it. And so that included rituals, which often involve a material side. And over time, these things became extraordinarily complex and elaborate, and are although there are many, an infinite number of ways human beings seem able to create culture, there are certain commonalities. And modern culture is not really any different, except that the technology is so much more developed, and as a result, some of the skills are so specialized. But you'll see, in baseball or hockey or soccer or whatever, that you are, that's the lower one is right is an Aztec ball game. What you're looking at are very specialized individuals with skill sets and skill hierarchies that take decades to acquire, and are very rare at the very top of the hierarchy. And so you have this interweaving of technology, expression, and culture, including the mimetic dimension in art, as well as the technological dimension, which comes from material culture. So, in a sense, mind sharing cultures share mimetic imagination, and culture becomes a group performance. So, in a 18th century opera, for example, there were the individuals in this theater who are the audience have to know things to know what's going on. They have to, for one thing, know that they're not up on the stage. They act differently because they're an audience. They have to understand the gestures, the languages, the allegories and illusions that they're making in order to get whatever to understand the performance, whatever it is. And all of culture is like that. No matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about a political rally or the coronation of a king or whatever. And mythic culture retained the mimetic within it. So this is the coronation of Elizabeth I when she was a lot younger than she is now. She looks like a little girl with a gigantic crown on her head. But what you'll notice is that in this audience, all of the different orders of society are represented. The church, the military, the educators, the administrators, etc., the politicians, and this is a mimetic display that reinforces the mythic hierarchy of stories and ideas that reinforces this whole system. And that's pretty well describes all of the traditional cultures of the planet. Mythic abstraction, interestingly, liberates you from concrete immediacy. It takes you out of this mundane world, if you want, into a virtual world of imagination. And languages also enabled personal autonomy to develop to a degree that was not possible before. People were less situation bound, more options. And given that a child can't control what culture he or she grows up in, you have to be very adaptive to be a human being, because you and I with the same genes might have been born into, let's say, a gang of Viking raiders, 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, or we might have been born in any number of different circumstances that were very different from our own. And our brains essentially are so plastic and adaptable that children just soak this up and they adapt remarkably well. All right, so if the third big leap was something that came out of material culture, so the first two adaptations to mimesis, procedural memory, and then to symbolic invention were mostly in the brain, although they resulted in material culture starting to develop. But where things changed cognitively in such a way that I proposed a third transition was in the case of symbolic literacy, because what it involved was an escape from the brain. The brain is, in a sense, a prison. It has limitations. And when any culture that relies entirely on the oral tradition, for example, is still relying on the capacity of the individual brain. Once you escape from that and start developing artificial memory devices, you lead to a totally different type of thinking and a totally different type of recall as a collective, as a society. Your brain isn't any different, but what happens is that you have artificial memory devices that I call exograms, because the traditional word that describes a memory in the brain is an engram. It's a memory archive in the brain. An exogram is a memory record of whatever kind outside the brain. So why was this such a big deal? Well, because exograms are quasi-permanent. They can outlive individuals. They have unlimited capacities, things like encyclopedias, which you can't possibly carry around in your head, or Wikipedia. New retrieval options. Well, of course, you can Google now, but even before that, you had card indexes in libraries and any number of indexes in books. Exograms are reformatable. You can't reformat your brain, sorry. And they're programmable. That is a new development that I think is maybe going to lead to the fourth transition. That is, these exograms can perform cognitive work and increasingly are becoming more intelligent. I just list a few of the external storage systems that we have. We started to develop libraries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and then, of course, now our storage systems are essentially infinite. There are no limits. Where I wrote a book, an article was pretty widely circulated about 30 years ago, before the internet got so powerful, and while we were still reading on pieces of paper. And I tried actually counting the size of the largest libraries in the world, and there is a progression until you go electronic, in which case there's no point in doing it anymore because you're into infinity. Now, I emphasize that exograms are not just about writing. Exograms involve the physical environment around you. So this is Stonehenge. That's an astronomical computer. It also calculated eclipses. It also controlled the rhythm of life in agricultural societies around it. Determined many things about life. You have mathematics, which is a different type of symbol, but perhaps the best example of a form of thought that is literally impossible without the right notations. The history of mathematics is a history of notations and notational inventions. Maps are another one that serve a very particular function. None of these things can be done just in your brain. And the technology that surrounds the production of external symbols is extraordinary. The engineering diagrams, and of course the heavy stuff, the indices that take you around in the literate world, in the world of symbols. And some operations are simply impossible without that. Plus, the use of symbols to construct the built environment, which is, of course, very common. All of these kinds of thinking were literally impossible before you had the development of the exographic world into larger and larger and more complex forms. Now, if you combine that literate mind with the storytelling mind, with the mimetic mind, you're starting to see the difference between a human mind and the Miocene ape from which we came. All of this is add-on. And of course, that's why our brains are so ridiculously huge. We have a cognitive load that is incomparably large. We live in hybrid cognitive ecosystems now. That is, that are part material culture and part our brains, and our brains have to function in this world, which is posing a threat of reducing the importance of human beings in the whole scheme of things, or at least of the individual. Of course, collectively, we're still an essential component. External symbolic storage systems now encircle the globe, and exographic networks have merged with smart tools and technology and dominating the world economy. the degree to which this domination has taken over is evident in institutions like Amazon, which are global and almost inconceivably large and complex. Which raises a question, and it's a question I'm concerned about, which is the dominance of the machine part of our hybrid mind. We think collectively, and almost all of our major decisions, even within families, are shared, but within corporations there and governments and so on, they're massively shared. And these global knowledge environments are increasingly driven by the demands of machines. Stock markets, engineering, military conflicts. The conflict in Ukraine is now one that's largely strategic and largely dependent on technology, which is very unfortunate because the individual soldiers, in many cases, are more victims than heroes. Anyway, I don't want to go in that direction. There's a huge impact on your episodic experience, that is, on the perception of past, present, and future. And I think there has been generally a regression away from literacy towards the mimetic mode, movies, TV, etc., but also social networks. The reduced presence of shared coherent narratives is very hard to construct an old-fashioned culture in the modern world. That's an elaborate issue in its own right. In some ways, we've lost something in moving towards a globalized, machine-dominated culture. And it raises uncomfortable issues such as whether you can afford to have humans in the equation anymore, and military issues. That's a terrifying prospect. Economic pressure is a direct result of plugging us all into a system that coerces you to play along. So there is a threat to self autonomy, and I'm worried about that. So the church transition was not equally present in all anatomically modern human cultures. That's obvious. And so there is this global tension as we try to work out the way of living with this incredibly complicated cognitive ecology. Modern global culture has reached a point where there is destabilization occurring. I don't think it's unique to any country. It's happening all over the world. And the actual age, some people ask the question, or do we need to enter another actual age? Well, the actual age is a term coined by Jaspers many years ago to describe a period prior to year zero, which hypothetical, BC versus AD. So 800 to 200 BC was a period when all of the major religious traditions of the world came into existence. And many people have been interested in this because even though Buddhism and Christianity or at that time, Hebrew religion, Greek religion, Indian religion, they were reactions to society becoming more and more complicated and more illiterate and organized and so on. And are we entering a new age that requires that kind of reaction? And it is something that you have to think about. So you take your traditional brain and you organize it around a global and electronic information environment, and you have in between traditional limitations, that you have. For example, what I call the external memory field now involves electronics. So if you have a smartphone and you have a computer on your desk, but you also have books and papers and so on, and you also talk to people, Your external memory field is actually very complicated. It has a lot of things in it. It allows you to move around in the idea sphere, if you want, the noosphere, in three-dimensional space, which is quite remarkable. But you have all of the traditional pathways as well, and you have to sort this out with an old-fashioned brain. It's a problem. We now have an additional complication, which agency of the machine. Machines are no longer passive devices like clocks or early computers. They're pushing the limits, actually. And I don't know if you know the work of Nicholas Carr, a number of other people who write about the impact of the internet and this and smartphones and so on people, but it's very disruptive, and the machines are actual agents now in the world. That's a new element, and possibly the basis for a fourth transition. So I've subbed this up in a table that up to this point has been widely circulated and is known, but this last line is a different one. We went through a primate world, episodic world of apes and monkeys, to the mimetic one millions of years ago, to the mythic stages from about a million and a half on. The theoretic culture of formal education and literacy came much more recently, very recently, in the last few thousand years. And then what some people have called the post-theoretic world, that is the world in which robots, artificial intelligence, and engineered experience, that's virtual reality, right, become dominant, possibly governing factors in our society. And the consequence of that is what I would call mode relativism. That is, you can alternate from day to day from being a mythic or a mimetic or a theoretic creature. All of prior modes are active at once. There's a hybridization of cognitive operations and a very smart ecology. And in many ways, the cognitive ecology has become a challenge for us, to put it mildly. How do we manage this? How do we prevent machines running off with it completely? That's my current obsession. That is, are we going through a fourth transition, and what can we do about it? Should we try to control it, or are we just going to be swept along by events whether we like them or not? That's a big question. But our virtual reality, in other words, which started off being pretty garden variety mammalian realities that would carry on in your head, now becomes this incredibly complicated world that we live in. That's the question, I think, for the next generation to deal with. I'm going to leave it at that. I would remind you that we carry all of this at the same time in our heads. It's a very difficult and challenging thing for human beings. We have to be a bit humble. We're just, slightly modified apes with big brains, and we have to reconcile ourselves with that fact. But what do we need to live with all of this? Our traditional cultures had reached a certain plateau, I think, of adaptation. It's not clear to me where the modern world is leading us, because technology is intrusive. It intrudes on all 3 or 4 of these levels of processing in the brain. And information technology can now intervene directly in every historical stage of cognitive activity that we've inherited. And this intervention can radically reconfigure the architecture of mind. So we have to be very careful. This technology we're playing with right now is dynamite. It's extremely important. So final conclusion, brains of individuals are no longer the main source of human cognitive power. They're an integral component of a very large distributed hybrid system that includes both brains and smart machines. A machine agenda is emerging whereby the human animate component of our human machine system is shrinking in influence, while the influence of the machine or the inanimate component is growing exponentially. This is possibly the start of a fourth transition, destination unknown, and a threat to every past definition of what features distinguish the human mind. Remember that mind can evolve and change much faster than the body. So I'll leave you with this. Human beings with our plasticity and variability have been very adaptive to this point. I just hope we don't push it too fast and too far. And maybe we need to slow down a bit. Here's food for paranoia for those of you like obsessing these things. You've got a globally connected billionaire overclass who don't have to work, potentially in possession of surveillance technology and control of modern military equipment, reinforced with robots and artificial intelligence and advanced genomic capabilities. They can even breed human beings. Possible scenario, human traditional people become truly domesticated like cattle, and the rule of a sociopathic overclass becomes entrenched. Of course, I'm just being provocative here, but ultimately the overclass meets its match and becomes unnecessary in its own right. And this is the cover from the New Yorker about a year ago, which I love. The person is begging there, and the robots are prospering. It's a human and cognitive evolution. Are we moving forward or backward? That's it. Thank you.
Well, that's a little bit overwhelming, Dr. Donald. I really, really appreciate that. There are probably a million questions. I don't know if anybody has any. Let me just start off the questions, and we have some VR students here. We have a very, very active and sort of, I would call it maybe even groundbreaking VR development program here. Not just
Okay.
VR, but all kinds of digital artifacts. And I just wanted to ask you, based on that, you had talked about narrative form. I would like to know what your ideas are on the concept of gestural storytelling, like the concept of telling stories pre-linguistic. It seems to me that narratives were first told gesturally, and that for human cognition, stories would have been intrinsically gestural, right? But then now with all the text that's come about in the past 1,000 years, we've lost that. And I believe that maybe virtual reality as a storytelling medium can give us a chance to kind of reinsert gestural communication into storytelling.
Well, I think to some degree that's happened already in movies, but although it's gestural, it's not simple. The conventions are really quite complicated. I don't know if you know the work of Rudolf Arnheim on movies and so on. That's a generation in the past, but he was a pioneer in that field. He was at Harvard for a while. Very interesting guy, but I think videos and film have moved us very, very strongly in mimetic direction. But back in if you go to Indonesia anytime, you see the old Indonesian pantomimes and stories. They very often told stories that way. Also in the medieval Europe, medieval mystery plays and morality plays and so on had a big gestural element, and I think that's still crucial. The novel of especially in the 19th century, when it was the major art form, if you want, the novel seems to be purely literate, but it alludes to gesture. I mean, you can convert a lot of novels into movies or into operas, and that's another very gesture-related form. I think that there's pluses and minuses. Gesture is very efficient, and it's very communicative, and especially in the mimetic domain, you can explore in a creative way emotions, and film can be incredibly subtle that way in ways that you can't
Right.
really easily write down. Yeah.
And what I've noticed as a VR user is emotion is just is exponentially increased by the fact that you are doing the gesture yourself.
Is
So
that
I
good
was
or bad?
That's a great question. I don't think it's either. I think it's dangerous and exciting at the same time because, for
Mm.
instance, when you're doing a VR experience and someone comes at you and you kill them by moving your arm to hit them, it's a very different experience. I've been overwhelmed emotionally by killing the wrong person in VR, to be honest with you. And I've never had that experience in a flat screen game, and I've never had that experience watching a movie. So it's very different.
What about predator drone pilots? That is to say, they get very emotional. Some of them have PTSD. I mean, you know, they, even though they're thousands of miles away from their targets, um, their their emotional engagement is tremendous. I think virtual it's virtually a VR technology, that particular one, and it can be very engaging. In fact, perhaps overwhelming. At least in the case of print, you can distance yourself a bit, and
Right.
I
And
can.
even flat screen, yeah.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, there's, but I haven't. I'm not sure that I've ever seen VR technology that is fully convincing. But it's coming down the line. I'm sure. I'm just not
Right.
very up on that. But I'm a bit afraid of it
Yeah,
because.
and the fear is justified because it doesn't have to be realistic. That's the thing I've learned by studying VR is your brain makes the shortcuts, right? When there's little shortcuts inside of VR, your brain just kind of grays those out and focuses on what's clear. And so the even though the technology is not there, the emotional experience is already there, you know?
Mhm.
So,
It's potentially real dynamite. I mean, imagine what you could do
yeah,
politically with VR. I don't
right.
even want to think about it.
Well, look, I think we have a question here. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, why don't you use this so that we can make sure Dr. Donald can hear you? We got a
Yeah.
question from the audience.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor. First off, could you back up one slide to the paranoid slide?
Yep.
Thank you. Hold on. Sorry, you moved on before I took all those notes down. Thank you. Again, it's an honor. Thank you. I had a question about axial age you touched on. I know Jasper did the work on that,
Yep.
more of a
Or
sociological, as
Carl
much as it
Jasper.
was,
Yeah.
pardon?
Carl Jaspers. Yes.
Mhm. It was sociological as much as it was theological um,
Yes.
advancement and study. I know Bella did some work advanced on what you had done in that area. You've written on it
Yes.
extensively as well. I had a question, and there's been some discussion about, because you mentioned the next axial age, whether enlightenment was that, whether modernity has been one. I would love your thoughts on what you referred to as the fourth post-theoretic transition. What are the implications, if there are any, implications of theology as it relates to a post-theoretic advancement? What role would technology play in, I guess, advancing us through any theological shifts?
Well, I mean, you know, theology is a very interesting field because I like the work of David Bentley Hart, by the way, who's to my mind is one of the more interesting ones because he's so philosophically sophisticated. But I think that when you look at what what theology traditionally was concerned with, of course, it's in a sense, it's an imagination game, isn't it? I mean, we are toying with ideas of perfection and of infinite infinity, and then the relationship of those ideals to our own personal cultivation, if you want. And one of the things that we lost when we, especially in the 60s, when we, I think, rather unwisely decided to wash our hands of our entire history, I think that we got away from two things. We got away from the idea that the individuals has a soul. That is, it's more than just a mind, and it has more than just reflexive emotions and so on, and pleasure and pain and so on. That it's actually a world in which individual, if you want to describe individuals, you have to conceive of the richness of a soul. When we talk about soul music or whether somebody has a soul, that's a meaningful statement. And psychology for a long time abandoned the world of the subjective, and that was a big mistake, but the whole culture did at one point. So it becomes a barbaric culture at that point, selfish, pleasure-oriented, superficial. We could learn a lot by looking carefully at our own history, and I come from a European background, so I can speak to that. I don't know much about the Far East. I think I know that it has a very elaborate cultural history. I just don't speak any of those languages or read any of them. But cultivation of the individual as something to be respected and something that has dignity is something we've gotten away from, and we need to get back to that. So theology has a lot to do with that, because whether you are a believing a religious person, or whether you see theology as I do as a sort of philosophical activity that is concerned with reconciling to some degree the mythic, mimetic, and the theoretic, which is, I think, an entirely honorable thing to do. I think that the fourth transition is going to demand a rethink of the scale of the axial age and its consequences. It's all of the things that developed afterwards, which includes Christianity and Islam and the Reformations, and the Renaissance, and the secular revolutions of the 18th century. Those are all part of the picture, and we're going to have to do. There's a lot of work to be done. That's assuming we get through the day over the next militarily
Right.
over the next 20 years.
Well, there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope some of the people that are going to do that work are the people that were here at this conference today in person and also online. I just want to thank Dr. Culver, Dr. Boulanger, and Dr. Donald for enlightening us, and also thank you so much for the incredible conversations in between. That was what I was really hoping for. I really do believe that we are on the cusp of a new era in education because of technologies like virtual reality. And I think that SMU is positioned well to be a leader in this field, and this space. Part of that is because of you. So thank you for coming. Please pay attention, because I hope that this is just the first of these where we talk about what do we do in VR besides entertain ourselves. We can learn about ourselves, our ancient selves, our modern selves. And so I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Donald. This was really amazing. I will, I will review this footage with enthusiasm. So thank you so much for being here in person and sharing tacos. Thank you for joining us online. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.